When three drunk miners in 1,867 Arizona territory offered the preacher's innocent daughter to gambler Jake Morrison as payment for their poker debt, the whole town expected him to claim his shameful prize. But what Jake did instead would transform not only his own destiny, but reveal a truth about honor that shocked everyone in Copper Ridge could. A man who'd built his life on taking advantage of others find the courage to risk everything for what was right. The sound of poker chips hitting the saloon table cut through the thick Arizona night like gunshots. Jake Morrison's fingers moved across his cards with the skill of a man who had learned that staying alive often depended on reading faces better than reading books. The Copper Ridge Saloon in 1,867 was the kind of place where dreams came to die, and tonight, three men were about to lose more than just their money. "I'm out," growled Pete Chambers, throwing his cards down so hard they scattered across the worn wooden table. Sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cool desert evening. The big miner had already lost his week's pay, his horse, and his father's pocket watch. His bloodshot eyes searched the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. Across from him, Jake sat perfectly still. Years of gambling had taught him that the slightest movement could give away a winning hand. His brown hat cast shadows over his weathered face, hiding eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. At 32, he looked older, the kind of aging that came from living hard and trusting nobody. "Come on, Pete," whispered Tom Briggs, the youngest of the three miners. His hands shook as he reached for his beer. Tom couldn't be more than 20, with a scraggly beard that made him look like a boy playing dress-up. "We can't quit now. We're in too deep." The third man, Bill Crawford, said nothing. He just stared at his empty whiskey glass, like it might magically fill itself. Bill had been mining copper in these parts for 15 years, and his silence spoke louder than any words. When Bill Crawford stopped talking, it meant trouble was coming. Jake studied the three men carefully. He had seen this look before, the desperate hunger of people who had nothing left to lose. These were dangerous moments in a gambling man's life. Men did crazy things when their backs were against the wall. "Maybe we should call it a night," Jake said quietly, his voice steady as stone. He had learned long ago that showing mercy could sometimes save your life. But mercy was a luxury he couldn't always afford. "No." Pete slammed his fist on the table, making the oil lamp flicker. The sudden movement caught the attention of everyone in the saloon. The piano music stopped. Conversations died. Even the bartender paused in his glass cleaning. Jake's hand moved closer to the gun on his hip. Not obvious list, just a slight shift that prepared him for whatever came next. In towns like Copper Ridge, arguments often ended with bullets instead of words. "We got something else," Pete continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Something worth more than money." Tom's face went pale. "Pete, you can't mean—" "Shut up, boy." Pete's eyes never left Jake's face. The preacher's daughter, Clara Henley, sweet as apple pie and pure as mountain snow. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach, colder than the desert wind that howled through the canyon at night. Around them, the saloon had gone completely silent. Even the toughest cowboys knew there were some lines a man shouldn't cross. "She ain't yours to wager," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning that most smart men would heed. But desperation made men stupid. Pete leaned forward, his breath stinking of cheap whiskey and broken dreams. "She's 19 and never been kissed. Preacher keeps her locked up tighter than a bank vault. But we know where she lives. We know her habits." Bill Crawford finally spoke, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Her daddy's getting old. Can't protect her forever. Town's got no sheriff worth mentioning." He looked up at Jake with eyes that had lost all hope. "You win this hand, she's yours for a week. Do whatever you want with her." Jake's jaw tightened. He had done many things in his life that he wasn't proud of, but this crossed a line he had never even considered crossing. "And if I lose?" "You won't," Tom said miserably. "You never lose." That was almost true. Jake Morrison had built his reputation on being the best poker player in the Arizona territory. He could read men like open books and count cards like a mathematician. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the kind of night that changed everything. One hand, Pete said, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. He scribbled something on it with a pencil stub. Winner takes all. Jake stared at the paper. On it, Pete had written Clara's name and address. Below that, he had signed his own name, along with Tom's and Bill's. It was a contract written in desperation and sealed with shame. The smart thing would be to walk away. Jake had enough money to last him months. He could ride out of Copper Ridge tonight and never look back. But something kept him in his chair, maybe curiosity, maybe pride, maybe something darker that he didn't want to examine too closely. He picked up the cards and began to shuffle. The sound echoed through the silent saloon like distant thunder promising a storm. Clara Henley stood on the wooden steps of the small church, watching the sun paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple. The morning air carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of mining equipment from the hills above town. At 19, she had learned to find beauty in simple things, the way morning light fell across the churchyard, the sound of birds greeting the new day, the peaceful silence before the town woke up. Her father was inside the church, preparing for Sunday's service. Doc Henley had been the preacher in Copper Ridge for 12 years, ever since Clara's mother had died, giving birth to a son who lived only 3 days. The loss had marked both father and daughter, making them closer but also more protective of the small happiness they had built together. Clara wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, with a white apron that showed the careful mending of someone who made old things last. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from reading every book in her father's small library at least twice. She was sweeping the church steps when she saw them coming down the main street, 3 men walking slowly, their heads hanging like dogs who had been caught stealing chickens. Behind them, at a distance that seemed both respectful and dangerous, walked a 4th man. Even from far away, Clara recognized Jake Morrison. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew the gambling man with the brown hat and the reputation for winning. He was the kind of man her father warned her about, the kind who lived by taking advantage of others' weaknesses. But as they got closer, Clara noticed something unexpected in Jake's face. Where she had expected to see the smug satisfaction of a man who had won a prize, she saw something that looked almost like pain. Pete Chambers reached the church steps first, his big frame blocking the morning sun. His hands twisted his hat nervously, and he couldn't meet Clara's eyes. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice cracking like dry leather, we need to talk to you." Clara set down her broom carefully, the way someone might set down something precious and fragile. She had grown up in a frontier town. She knew that when 3 desperate men came to your door with a gambling man behind them, it usually meant trouble of the worst kind. "Good morning, Mr. Chambers," she said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. "Mr. Briggs, Mr. Crawford." She looked past them to Jake Morrison. "Mr. Morrison." Tom Briggs stepped forward, his young face red with shame. "Clara, we made a mistake. A terrible mistake. We were drunk," Bill Crawford added quickly, as if that explained everything. Clara felt her heart starting to beat faster. She had heard enough confessions in her father's church to know when men were building up to something awful. What kind of mistake? Pete Chambers pulled out the crumpled paper from his pocket. His hands shook as he held it out to her. "We wagered you in a poker game against Mr. Morrison here." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She stared at the paper with her name written on it in Pete's messy handwriting, and felt the world tilt sideways. "You did what?" The voice came from behind her. Doc Henley had emerged from the church, his Bible still in his hands. The old preacher's face went through several emotions: confusion, understanding, and then a rage that Clara had never seen in her gentle father. "Now, Doc," Pete said, backing up a step, "we were drunk. We didn't mean—" "You wagered my daughter like she was a piece of property?" Doc Henley's voice rose with each word. "Like she was a horse or a saddle?" Jake Morrison finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the morning air. "The debt's been paid according to their terms, but Miss Clara's not property. She's a person with her own choices to make." Clara looked at him with surprise. This wasn't what she had expected from a man with his reputation. "What exactly does that mean, Mr. Morrison?" Jake removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat and eyes that seemed older than his face. "It means we need to figure out a way through this mess that doesn't hurt you or your father." "The contract's legal," Bill Crawford said miserably. "We signed it. Witnesses saw it." "Legal and right aren't always the same thing," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. She had been raised on her father's teachings about justice and mercy, and she had learned to think for herself. There has to be another way. Jake stepped closer, and Clara caught the scent of leather and tobacco, mixed with something else, maybe regret. "What if we pretended? What if I escorted you around town for a week, just for appearances, but nothing else happened?" The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist. Clara studied Jake's face, looking for lies or hidden intentions. What she found surprised her genuine concern for her welfare, mixed with something that might have been self-disgust. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Jake's answer came slowly, as if he was figuring it out himself. "Because some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter what the law says." Behind them, Doc Henley was quiet, watching his daughter with the careful attention of a man who had learned to trust her judgment. The three miners shifted uncomfortably, probably hoping this would end their part in the nightmare they had created. Clara made her decision with the same careful thought she gave to everything important in her life. 1 week. "You escort me to town functions. We sit on the porch in the evenings where everyone can see us. And at the end of 7 days, you announce that you're releasing me from the arrangement." Jake nodded slowly, agreed. But as Clara shook his hand to seal their bargain, she couldn't shake the feeling that this week would change both their lives in ways none of them could predict. The checkers board sat between them on the porch, like a battlefield where neither side wanted to win. 3 days had passed since their strange agreement began, and Clara Henley found herself looking forward to these evening games more than she cared to admit. Jake Morrison had surprised her by being nothing like the cold-hearted gambler she had expected. "Your move," Jake said, leaning back in the wooden chair that creaked under his weight. The setting sun painted everything in warm orange light, and the sounds of Copper Ridge settling down for the night drifted around them, dogs barking, children being called inside, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Clara studied the board carefully. She had been playing checkers since she was 6 years old, taught by her father during long winter evenings. But Jake played differently than anyone she had ever faced. He thought several moves ahead, like he was reading a story that hadn't been written yet. "Tell me something," she said, moving a black piece forward. "How did you learn to read people so well?" Jake captured her piece with a red checker, but his victory seemed to bring him no joy. "When you grow up with nothing, you learn that people's faces tell you more than their words ever will. A man might say he's your friend, but his eyes will tell you if he's planning to rob you." That sounds like a lonely way to live. It kept me alive. Jake's fingers drummed against the porch railing. But alive and living aren't the same thing, are they? From inside the house, they could hear Doc Henley humming as he prepared his Sunday sermon. The old preacher had been watching their interactions carefully, but Clara could tell he was starting to trust Jake's intentions. Trust was something that had to be earned slowly in a place like Copper Ridge. "What would you do if you weren't gambling?" Clara asked, jumping 2 of his pieces in a move that made Jake raise his eyebrows with respect. "I used to think about having a ranch, raising horses, maybe cattle, building something that would last longer than a winning streak." He paused, looking out at the desert that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. "But that was a long time ago, before I learned that dreams are just another way to lose money." Clara won the game, but as she was putting the pieces away, a commotion from the main street caught their attention. Riders were coming into town, 6 men on horseback, moving with the kind of careful formation that meant they were either soldiers or trouble. Jake stood up quickly, his hand automatically moving toward his gun. "Stay here," he told Clara, but she was already standing beside him, trying to see who the strangers were. The lead rider was a tall man with a black beard and cold eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were dusty from hard travel, and the guns on his hips looked well used. Behind him, 5 other men spread out as they entered town, positioning themselves like wolves surrounding prey. "Black Jack Dalton," Jake whispered, and Clara heard real fear in his voice for the first time. "You know him?" By reputation. He's an outlaw who robs banks and kills anyone who gets in his way. What's he doing in Copper Ridge? They got their answer when Black Jack's voice boomed across the quiet street. Jake Morrison, I hear you won yourself a pretty prize in a poker game. Maybe it's time to see if your luck holds when the stakes get higher. Clara felt Jake tense beside her. The peaceful evening had suddenly turned dangerous, and she realized that their pretend arrangement might have painted a target on both their backs. Get inside, Jake said urgently. Lock the doors and don't come out until I tell you it's safe. But Clara had grown up on the frontier. She knew that running and hiding didn't always keep you safe. Sometimes it just made you an easier target. What are you going to do? I'm going to try to talk my way out of this without anyone getting hurt. Jake checked his gun and started down the porch steps. But if shooting starts, promise me you'll stay inside. As Jake walked toward the main street, Clara watched from the window. She could see Black Jack and his men spreading out, controlling the key points in town: the saloon, the general store, the stable. They moved like men who had done this many times before. From her hidden position, Clara also noticed something else. Tom Briggs was peeking out from behind the barbershop, holding an old rifle. Pete Chambers had positioned himself near the church with a shotgun. Even Bill Crawford was visible in the shadows by the bank, armed and ready. The three miners who had started this whole mess were preparing to fight for her honor. The irony wasn't lost on Clara. Men who had treated her like property were now willing to risk their lives to protect her. But the biggest surprise came when she saw her father emerge from the church carrying his old army rifle from the war. Doc Henley had been a soldier before he became a preacher, and Clara could see that some skills never completely disappeared. As Jake reached the middle of the street, Black Jack dismounted with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Morrison, time to find out if you're as good with that gun as you are with cards. The confrontation that everyone expected was about to begin, but Clara realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about whether Copper Ridge would stand together or fall apart when real danger came calling. And somehow, their fake arrangement had become the test that would determine the answer. The standoff in the street stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Black Jack Dalton circled Jake Morrison slowly, his boots clicking against the hard-packed dirt with the rhythm of a clock counting down to violence. But what Jake saw around the edges of the street gave him something he hadn't expected: hope. You know, Morrison, Black Jack said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. I've been hearing stories about you all the way from Tucson. They say you're the luckiest gambler in the territory. Jake kept his hands loose at his sides, ready but not threatening. Luck's got nothing to do with it. I just pay attention to what other people miss. Is that so? Black Jack stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to draw. What am I missing right now? Jake glanced quickly around the street, taking inventory of the townspeople he could see. You're missing the fact that you rode into the wrong town on the wrong night. Black Jack laughed, a sound like gravel being poured into a bucket. 6 guns against one gambling man and a bunch of scared miners? I like those odds. Count again. The voice came from Sheriff Wells, who stepped out from behind the jail with a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. The sheriff was old, and his hands shook slightly, but his eyes were steady and determined. Now that's more like it, Black Jack said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Still 6 against 2. 3. Doc Henley emerged from the shadows near the church, his rifle held with the professional competence of an old soldier. I fought in the war, son. Haven't forgotten how. Black Jack's smile faded completely when Tom Briggs stepped into view, then Pete Chambers, then Bill Crawford. One by one, the people of Copper Ridge revealed themselves: the blacksmith with his hammer, the storekeeper with an old pistol, even Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house carrying a kitchen knife. Seems like the whole town's got something to say about this, Jake observed, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He had spent years moving from place to place, never staying long enough to belong anywhere. But somehow, in just 3 days, Copper Ridge had decided he was worth protecting. Black Jack's men were looking nervous now. They had signed up to rob a few scared townspeople, not fight a war against an entire community. The youngest of the outlaws, a kid who couldn't be more than 18, actually took a step backward. This ain't over, Morrison, Black Jack snarled. but he was already moving toward his horse. "A man's got to sleep sometime. Got to let his guard down." "Maybe," Jake replied. "But maybe that man won't be sleeping alone anymore." As the outlaws mounted their horses and rode out of town, the tension slowly drained from the street, like water from a broken barrel. People began to emerge from their hiding places, talking excitedly about what had just happened. But Jake's attention was focused on the church porch, where Clara stood watching everything with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. She walked down the steps slowly, her blue dress rustling in the evening breeze. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said when she reached him. "Probably both." Jake holstered his gun, surprised to find his hands were shaking slightly, but it worked. This time, Clara looked in the direction the outlaws had ridden. "What happens when they come back?" "We'll be ready for them." The voice belonged to Pete Chambers, who approached with his hat in his hands and shame written across his face. "Clara, we owe you an apology that words can't cover." Tom Briggs nodded miserably. "We started this mess with our drinking and our stupidity, but we'll finish it right." "You don't owe me anything," Clara said gently, "but you owe yourselves better choices." Bill Crawford, who had been silent through most of their conversations, finally spoke up. "My wife left me because of my drinking. My kids won't talk to me. I've been angry at the world for so long, I forgot how to be angry at myself." "It's not too late to change," Doc Henley said, joining their small group. "A man's past doesn't have to determine his future." As the townspeople dispersed, heading home to their families and their dinners, Jake found himself walking with Clara back toward the church. The crisis was over, but something had shifted during the confrontation. The pretend arrangement they had started was beginning to feel real in ways that scared him. "Thank you," Clara said as they reached the porch steps, "for standing up to them, for protecting not just me, but everyone. I didn't do it alone." "No, but you started it. You could have run. You could have handed me over to them to save yourself. Instead, you chose to fight." Jake sat down on the porch steps, suddenly feeling exhausted. "I'm not a good man, Clara. I've taken advantage of people, cheated at cards when I had to, walked away from trouble instead of facing it. I don't deserve the way this town rallied around me tonight." Clara sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. "Maybe deserving has nothing to do with it. Maybe grace works differently than we think." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe you don't get love because you deserve it. Maybe you deserve it because you get it." Jake looked at her profile in the growing darkness, trying to understand what was happening to him. For the first time in years, he was starting to care more about someone else's welfare than his own. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. "2 more days," he said quietly. "Then our agreement ends." "Yes," Clara replied, but neither of them moved to go inside. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear over Copper Ridge, both wondering if some agreements were meant to be broken and others were meant to last forever. The explosion that shattered the morning calm sent Clara tumbling from her bed to the wooden floor. Outside, shouts and gunfire erupted like a deadly symphony as Black Jack Dalton's revenge began with the general store going up in flames. Through her bedroom window, she could see orange fire licking at the sky and black smoke billowing across the main street. "Clara!" her father's voice boomed from downstairs. "Stay away from the windows." But Clara was already pulling on her dress and boots. She had spent 6 days learning that hiding wasn't always the safest choice. Sometimes you had to move toward danger to find your way through it. Jake Morrison was running toward the church from the boarding house where he'd been staying, his gun already in his hand. Behind him, the general store burned like a giant torch, and she could see Black Jack's men using the confusion to position themselves around town. "They came back at dawn," Jake shouted as he reached the church porch. "Set fire to the store to flush everyone out into the open." Doc Henley appeared beside Clara carrying his rifle and a medical bag. "How many of them?" "Still 6. But they're spread out this time. Smarter." Jake's eyes scanned the street, reading the situation like he would read a poker hand. "They've got the saloon, the bank, and now they're using the fire to control the center of town." Mrs. Patterson came running from the boarding house, her gray hair flying loose from its pins. "They shot Sheriff Wells," she cried. "He's alive, but he's hurt bad." Clara felt her heart drop. The old sheriff had been like a grandfather to her, always bringing her peppermint sticks and asking about her reading. Where is he? In the jail. Can't move him, but he's bleeding. Without thinking, Clara started toward the main street. Jake caught her arm gently but firmly. It's too dangerous. They'll be watching for movement. Then we make them watch the wrong movement. Clara's mind was working quickly, the way it did when she was solving a difficult problem from her father's books. What if some of us created a distraction while others helped the sheriff? Jake studied her face with the same intensity he brought to reading cards. What kind of distraction? Before Clara could answer, Tom Briggs came running around the side of the church, his young face streaked with soot. They're demanding you come out, Morrison. Said they'll burn down every building until you show yourself. Pete Chambers appeared next, followed by Bill Crawford. Both men carried weapons and looked ready to fight, but Clara could see the fear in their eyes. These were miners, not gunfighters. How long before the fire spreads? Doc Henley asked. Wind's picking up, Bill said grimly. If it reaches the feed store, the whole town could go up. Jake made his decision with the quick certainty that had kept him alive through years of dangerous situations. I'm going out there. Maybe I can end this without anyone else getting hurt. No. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. They didn't come here just to kill you. They came to make an example, to show that they can take whatever they want from whoever they want. She was right, and everyone knew it. Black Jack Dalton hadn't ridden back to Copper Ridge for revenge. He had come to prove that fear was stronger than community. Then what do you suggest? Jake asked. Clara looked around at the faces of the people who had become her friends and protectors over the past week. An idea was forming in her mind. Dangerous, but possible. What if we gave them what they think they want, but not the way they expect it? 20 minutes later, Clara Henley walked down the main street of Copper Ridge alone. She had insisted on this part of the plan, despite Jake's arguments and her father's fears. Sometimes, she had told them, the most unexpected person was the safest choice. She wore her best dress, the green one she saved for special occasions, and carried herself with the dignity of someone going to church rather than walking into a trap. Behind her, the general store continued to burn, but the bucket brigade had managed to keep the fire from spreading. Black Jack Dalton stepped out from behind the remains of the store, his gun drawn but pointed at the ground. Well, well, the little dove comes to visit. Mr. Dalton, Clara said politely, as if they had met at a social gathering, I believe you wanted to speak with Mr. Morrison. Where is he? He's coming. But first, I wanted to ask you something. Clara stopped about 15 feet away, close enough to talk normally but far enough to run if necessary. What exactly do you plan to do with me? The question seemed to surprise Black Jack. What do you mean? I mean, you've burned down a building, shot our sheriff and terrorized our town. All to get your hands on one 19-year-old girl who knows how to cook and mend clothes. Clara tilted her head as if genuinely curious. What happens after you win? Black Jack's confidence wavered slightly. That's none of your business. It seems like it should be. After all, I'm the prize you're fighting for. Clara took a small step forward. But here's what I don't understand. Why would a man like you, someone who can take whatever he wants, why would you want something that has to be given? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that taking me by force makes me worthless to you. A stolen horse is just transportation. A stolen woman is just a burden. Clara's voice remained calm and reasonable. But a woman who chooses to be with you? That's something with real value. Behind Black Jack, she could see his men exchanging confused glances. This wasn't the conversation they had expected. You trying to trick me, girl? I'm trying to understand what you really want. Because if what you want is someone who will cook your meals and mend your clothes and make you feel like a successful man, well, you can't get that by burning down towns and shooting sheriffs. Black Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gun still in his hand, but his attention completely focused on Clara's words. And if I wanted that from you, then you'd have to earn it, the way any man earns a woman's respect. Clara smiled slightly. But something tells me that's not really what this is about. She was right. As Clara had suspected, this had never been about wanting her. This was about proving that Black Jack Dalton could take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. but her questions had forced him to confront the emptiness of that victory. "You're a smart girl," he said finally. "Too smart for your own good." "Maybe, but smart enough to know that you're not going to hurt me." "Why's that?" "Because hurting me doesn't get you what you want, and taking me doesn't either." Clara gestured toward the burning building. "All this destruction, and for what? You'll ride away with nothing to show for it, except the knowledge that you scared some people." Black Jack holstered his gun slowly. Around the street, his men were watching this exchange with growing confusion. Their leader had always led through fear and violence, but this young woman was using words to disarm him more effectively than any weapon. "What are you proposing?" Clara's answer would determine whether Copper Ridge survived the morning intact, and whether the community that had formed around protecting her would prove stronger than the violence trying to tear it apart. 2 months later, Clara Morrison stood in the doorway of her new home, watching her husband guide their first horse into the small corral he had built behind the house. The autumn air carried the scent of pine from the mountains and the sound of hammering from town, where they were rebuilding the general store with help from an unexpected source. "That's beautiful work, Jake," called Bill Crawford from the fence line. The former miner had given up drinking and now worked as Jake's partner in their new horse ranch. The change in Bill had been remarkable. His hands were steady, his eyes clear, and his wife had even brought the children for a visit last week. Jake patted the mare's neck gently and smiled at Clara. Marriage had changed him in ways that surprised them both. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and he laughed more easily now. But the biggest change was in how he carried himself, with the confidence of a man who had found something worth protecting. "Hard to believe it's only been 2 months, Clara said, as Jake walked toward the house. "Feels like everything changed overnight." "Not everything." Jake kissed her forehead and handed her a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. "Some things just took time to grow." The letter was from Black Jack Dalton, written from a jail cell in Tucson where he was serving time for bank robbery. But the content surprised Clara, just as Black Jack himself had surprised everyone that morning when he had made his choice. "Miss Clara," the letter began, "I've been thinking about what you said that day in your town, about earning things instead of taking them, about what a man really wants versus what he thinks he wants. You were right about me not wanting to hurt you, but you were wrong about one thing. I did get something valuable from our meeting. I got a lesson I needed to learn. I turned myself in to the law after I left Copper Ridge. My men thought I was crazy, but I realized that taking things by force had never made me feel like a successful man. It just made me feel empty. I'm serving my time now, but when I get out, I'm going to try earning things the honest way. Thank you for showing me that strength isn't about making people afraid. Real strength is about making choices that make you worthy of respect. I hope you and Morrison are happy. If any man deserved a second chance, it's him. And if any woman could help a man find his better nature, it's you. Respectfully, Jack Dalton." Clara folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. Outside, she could hear Pete Chambers talking with Jake about expanding the horse operation. Pete had stopped drinking entirely and was now engaged to the schoolteacher from the next town over. Tom Briggs had used his mining money to buy a small farm and was learning to grow vegetables instead of digging holes in the ground. "Strange how everything worked out," Jake said, settling beside Clara on their front porch swing. "That night when I won that poker game, I thought I was winning something shameful. Turns out, I was winning the chance to become the man I was supposed to be." Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching the sun set over their small but growing ranch. "My father always said that God works in mysterious ways. Maybe sometimes the worst mistakes become the best opportunities." In town, the church bell rang 6 times, calling people to the evening service. Doc Henley had married them in that same church 8 weeks ago, with the whole town in attendance, including 3 former miners who had learned that redemption was possible for anyone willing to change. The new general store was nearly finished, built with money that Black Jack had left behind when he surrendered to the law. The owner planned to name it Second Chance's General Store, as a reminder that people could start over if they had the courage to try. "You know what I learned?" Jake said, taking Clara's hand in his. "All those years I thought I was winning at cards. I was actually losing the most important game of all." "What game was that?" The game of becoming someone worth loving. Jake squeezed her hand gently. Turns out the biggest gamble isn't risking what you have, it's risking who you are for the chance to become who you could be. Clara smiled and kissed his cheek. And what did you become? A man who understands that the best things in life aren't won or taken. They're earned through choosing to do right, even when it's hard. As the stars began to appear over their new home, Clara reflected on how much had changed since that morning when 3 drunk miners had tried to pay their debt with someone else's dignity. The town had learned that standing together made them stronger than any individual threat. The miners had learned that their worst decisions could become opportunities for growth. Blackjack had learned that real power came from choosing integrity over intimidation. And Jake had learned that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he could take from others, but by what he was willing to give of himself. But perhaps the most important lesson belonged to Clara herself. She had discovered that sometimes the best way to help someone find their better nature wasn't through lectures or judgments, but through the simple act of believing they were capable of change. Their fake arrangement had become real love. Their pretend partnership had become an honest marriage, and their temporary solution had become a permanent foundation for building something beautiful together. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Clara felt Jake's arm tighten protectively around her shoulders. But she wasn't afraid. She had learned that when people choose to stand together and support each other's growth towards something better, there wasn't much in this world that could tear them apart. The gambler had found his home. The preacher's daughter had found her partner, and Copper Ridge had found its soul in the simple truth that everyone deserves a second chance to become who they were meant to be. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from winning, but from having the wisdom to know when to fold a losing hand and bet everything on building something better. And sometimes, the best prizes aren't won at all. They're discovered in the courage to choose love over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. In the Arizona territory of 1,867, that was a lesson worth more than all the gold in the mountains and all the silver in the mines. It was a lesson that would echo through generations, reminding people that true wealth isn't found in what you can take, but in what you choose to give.